Now that we've done deep dives on Sun and Moon, X and Y, Black and White, Diamond and Pearl, Ruby and Sapphire, and Gold and Silver, today we're taking the next step and covering Generation 1. As always, I'll be highlighting cut content details that you probably haven't heard before, while also giving my analysis of the information. And just to clarify, despite the fact that this video is titled A Deep Dive into Pokémon Red and Blue, in the video I'll be referring to them as Pokémon Red and Green, since those were the original Japanese names. So let's jump right in, starting with the original pitch document from 1990, around 6 years before the release of the games. But before we get into that, let's set up some context. Game Freak was originally not a game development company. It was actually founded in the early 80s as a video game magazine publisher by Satoshi Tajiri. In fact, the very first issue of Game Freak magazine reveals that it was released in 1983. Ken Sugimori, who would later become the lead artist of Pokémon, happened to pick up a copy of the magazine, liked it, and decided to join Tajiri later on as the lead artist of the Game Freak magazine. Together they ran a relatively successful magazine that gained a following in the Japanese gaming scene. Tajiri even wrote 2 other publications under the pen name Game Freak during this time. The magazine itself lasted until about 1986, and then in 1989, Junichi Masuda joined the team. This was when the trio officially established Game Freak as a video game development company. That same year, they released their first ever game, Mendel Palace. Mendel Palace was surprisingly a hit, and the success of that game gave Satoshi Tajiri the opportunity to work on his dream project, a franchise that would later become Pokémon. And that brings us to 1990, when Game Freak created the original pitch document for a game called Capsule Monsters. This document outlined the core vision and design of what would eventually become Pokémon. So the first page sets up a hypothetical scenario, a world where Capsule Monsters has already been released for a month. It describes Capsule Monsters as an RPG-style monster game that focuses on dungeon exploration. The idea of catching these monsters was actually inspired by the Gachapon craze. Gachapon are capsule toy vending machines that are hugely popular in Japan. You insert a coin, turn the crank, and out comes a random toy sealed inside a capsule. And Capsule Monsters would capture the same element of surprise and let you collect monsters in-game. The game would be set in a virtual underground labyrinth, home to 200 virtual monsters. Right away, this feels like a very different experience compared to the final games, more reminiscent of a dungeon crawling RPG rather than an open adventure. Honestly, it kinda reminds me of a Mystery Dungeon series, which wouldn't exist for another decade. One of the most interesting mechanics mentioned in the pitch was the charisma value. Instead of just capturing monsters, it seems like you could also befriend them based on the stat. Game Freak had seen this mechanic in the Wizard games, and knew that it wasn't something typically seen in Japanese RPGs. Now, sidelining a bit, we know that Pokémon took inspiration from other turn-based monster games, especially Megami Tensei, which was one of the first turn-based RPGs to feature monster recruitment. But what's really interesting is that around the time of Pokémon Red and Green's development, Dragon Quest V released in 1992. Introducing its own monster catching mechanics. This is a game that has been frequently compared to Pokemon's gameplay, and since this came out 4 years before Red and Green came out, I wonder if Game Freak saw how Dragon Quest handled monster taming and pivoted away from the charisma idea in favor of a more straightforward monster catching system. Still, it's fascinating to think about how different Pokemon could have been if it kept this mechanic. Would we have seen some kind of dialogue system with Pokemon? Would the capture rate be tied to the player's choices instead of just throwing Pokeballs? It really makes you wonder. Oh, and that number of 200 monsters obviously didn't make it into the final game. Instead, we ended up with 151 Pokemon, meaning almost a quarter of the total monsters Game Freak wanted had to be removed. But here's where things get interesting. Among those 200 monsters, there was a planned mechanic for a specific set of creatures called Phantom Monsters. These were designed to be incredibly rare, difficult to find, difficult to befriend, and if you missed your chance to encounter one, that was it. You couldn't get them anymore. One of the examples given in the pitch document describes how you'd need to find 3 green dragons that only appear in a specific corner of a 4th floor of a dungeon, but even then there might be extra conditions. Maybe you had to stay in that area for 2 hours, or maybe your character needed to be a certain level, and perhaps your friend might not have any green dragons at all. Instead, they might have 2 fireflies that you've never seen before. This is how the concept of trading was born. The idea was that since you probably couldn't get every monster yourself, you'd have to connect with other players using the Game Boy's link cable. And here's a cool detail. While trading, both Game Boys would play music in harmony, a tune that sounded like the monsters crying, While we didn't get specific trade music in the final games, there was a scrapped idea that a cut soundtrack would play when trading, and both games would be used to play different parts of a song in harmony. Here's a snippet. But overall, this initial concept was genius. It wasn't just about completing a Pokédex, it was about shaping a unique experience for every player. No two playthroughs would be the same. Even today, I'd love to see a game experiment with this kind of idea. The Game Boy Link cable was probably the most standout feature of Pokémon Red and Green. And based on this original pitch document, it's clear that this was always the central selling point of the game. One of the more surprising details is that you could actually buy and sell these creatures. While it's probably better if this feature never made it into the final game, I think it's funny that in some alternate universe, Pokémon could have functioned like a stock market where players hustled to trade rare creatures for the best price. That said, a lot of the original ideas did make it into the final game. Stuff like carrying over experience between trades, a fighting arena where you battle other players, and an early idea for the Pokédex all made it in. Below this section of a pitch is something really cool, a rough sketch of a game's setting. If we look at where the starting town is placed, it actually lines up really well with where Pallet Town would be located on a real-world map. Also, the fact that this map shows an outdoor world, instead of being fully underground like the original pitch stated, suggests that the game's dungeons were accessed from the overworld, rather than the entire game being set in a labyrinth. So in a way, caves in the final games are kind of the last remnants of this idea. Now, assuming this was an earlier version of a map, Game Freak also seems to have drawn out a more finalized sketch of Kanto's layout, and it looks identical to the final game, with one big exception of another city in the middle. An interesting detail is that the marked locations seem to be the places where you'd find dungeons to catch monsters, whereas in the final game, these are just the towns, and you catch Pokémon in the routes between them. There's two sketches of the overworld gameplay. One seems to present the main overworld, the other seems to show the underground dungeons. Visually, the overworld looks really similar to the final game. The interesting part is that we actually get to see what a dungeon entrance would have looked like. Meanwhile, the underground map really fits that labyrinth-like description from earlier. Honestly, the idea of an underground dungeon system could have been really cool if it was like procedurally generated, making it an even more unique and randomized experience for every player. I wouldn't be surprised if they were thinking of ways to customize the map design for each player. Today's video is sponsored by Manta Sleep. They make the best sleep mask and functional sleep accessories, but there's more to Manta than that. Everything they do is driven by their pro-nap movement and enable better lives through better sleep. Manta sleep masks are fully adjustable to fit anyone. They provide 100% blackout and are made with incredibly soft and breathable materials. Plus, with their eye cups, there's absolutely no pressure on your eyes or eyelids for maximum comfort. They offer a range of masks to suit different needs, including the cool mask, steam mask, pro mask, weighted mask, and the sound mask, which comes with built-in Bluetooth speakers, perfect for listening to audiobooks, music, or your favorite podcast while you relax. A huge thank you to Manta Sleep for sponsoring this video. I love their products, so check them out using the link in the description. And don't forget to use code TURTLE for 10% off your order. Now let's get back to the video. Let's take a look at some of the early battle concepts. For the most part, the battle system was already much in place. However, both Pokemon's front sprites would be visible. We also have an early Pokemon summary screen concept, which features what looks like a beta version of Charizard. One small but interesting detail is that PP was originally called TP at this point. A concept for the Pokeballs shows that originally, the balls would have had a capsule lock that would need to be twisted to secure the captured Pokemon. This suggests that Pokemon were originally meant to fit inside the balls naturally. The idea of actually shrinking down into the ball is certainly an interesting concept. A couple more battle sketches show beta versions of Pokemon we recognize today. Also, what seems like a trainer literally whipping their Pokemon. This actually ties into an early idea for capsule monsters, where trainers would whip their Pokemon or sometimes even join in the fight. In fact, many of the early character designs, including the protagonist, were originally drawn with whips. This mechanic was eventually cut, but you can still see remnants of it in the final game, and that is why so many trainers in Generation 1 hold whips. Here's a couple concept art pieces that I thought were interesting. Obviously, a lot of this was impossible to achieve on the Game Boy, but it gives us a glimpse of a world and atmosphere that Game Freak originally envisioned. Honestly, the level of detail and charm in these sketches is something we could achieve in modern Pokemon games, at least on a technical level. Something else that caught my attention is this hotel check-in concept. I'm assuming that before Pokemon centers were a thing, you'd have to stay at hotels to heal your Pokemon. Also, I just love this classic Ken Sugimori art style. I really wish we could get a full 3D Pokemon game that fully embraces the style. It's probably never gonna happen officially, but I'd love to see a fan project bring this idea to life. There's just so much potential charm in it. Besides the scrapped Pokemon that we'll cover later, that's pretty much it for the pitch document. Now, regarding early development, Tajiri originally wanted to use the name Capsule Monsters, or Capumon for short. However, he couldn't trademark the name, which led to the team settling on Pocket Monsters instead. The first time Pokemon was publicly advertised, it seemed to be aiming for a December 1995 release. Possibly the earliest public screenshot of the game even appeared in a Famitsu ad. But as we now know, the game ended up being delayed by 2 months, launching in February 96 instead. The reason for this 2-month delay isn't entirely clear, but the only change we can confirm is that one NPC in Cerulean City was replaced with another. Going back to the early development, I want to highlight something interesting: Game Freak's internal Pokemon popularity polls. Essentially, they held these periodically during development to help decide which Pokemon designs they liked the most and which ones would make it into the final game. The first recorded poll took place in late 1992, and you might be surprised to hear that Executor was the #1 most popular Pokemon. According to TCRF, the earliest known iteration of a Kanto map dates all the way back to 92, and as noted, at this stage the game's tileset looks heavily inspired by Final Fantasy Legend. And in my opinion, while the final game's visuals still resemble the graphics as well, the influence of Final Fantasy Legend is much more noticeable here. Pallet Town looks very unfinished at this point, but I also think it highlights just how polished the final game ended up being. There's no doubt that Pokemon Red and Green are some of the best looking Game Boy titles ever made, and it makes sense given how long development time they were given. Route 1 also looks very different here. The early version was extremely linear, nothing like the more natural looking pathway we got in the final game. It's actually kind of crazy just how much they refined Route 1's design alone. I'm gonna flip through these early town maps, so if you wanna pause and take a look, feel free to do so. A lot of these are just unfinished versions of existing towns, maybe some different layouts here and there, but overall just unfinished tile sets. There are some interesting differences though. The most standout differences to me are the CVS and Inn buildings, which are probably the early versions of a Pokemon and Pokemon Center. Also further into the map, these massive roads connecting towns, possibly for cycling, which were later condensed into smaller pathways between routes. And of course, we have to take a look at the scrapped Pokemon from Red and Green. The pitch document alone actually features quite a few cut Pokemon designs. While a lot of these made it into the final game with little to no changes, some went for extensive redesigns. Interestingly, there's only one Pokemon from a pitch document that was completely cut, this Kaiju-inspired Pokemon. This little guy actually made it pretty far into development, even receiving a sprite in some beta builds, before being ultimately scrapped. There's speculation that it may have evolved into Tyranitar for Generation 2. We also get a look at even more cut designs in a Satoshi Tajiri manga, which was set in late 1992. These Pokemon were a part of the internal popularity polls that I mentioned earlier, and they include some completely scrapped designs. A deer-like Pokemon, an elephant, a crocodile, a cactus, a shark, and a balloon-like Pokemon were all featured here, but scrapped from a final game. The source code of Red and Blue actually reveals even more cut Pokemon, this time only their back sprites. Unfortunately, their front sprites were all updated for Japanese Blue, so we don't have those. Some of these include the Kaiju Pokemon, the Balloon Pokemon, the deer, elephant, crocodile, cactus, and shark, a new squid Pokemon, a new fish Pokemon line, a new lizard Pokemon line, and a new tiger Pokemon line, which seem to be the same scrapped Kotora line from Generation 2. There was also several scrapped evolutions of existing Pokemon, including pre-evolutions for Vulpix, Meowth, Goldeen, and Ponyta. Also a cut middle evolution between Psyduck and Golduck, a cut evolution for Marowak, and of course the infamous cut evolution of Raichu, aka Gorachu. And with that, we've covered pretty much all of the highlights from Red and Green scrapped content. If you guys enjoyed this video, go ahead and leave a like, subscribe, and share, and I'll see you in the next one.